help us complete the music hall. And we love it. I swear you'll get a good deal, great concert, great food and drink, a wonderful party, and a great cause. So that's last night. And I said, John, we'll be all sold out up here. Can't do it. So I'm sorry for following the second Saturday.
No, we meander through the whole building for benefit. It's
I live to this because
yes. So if you haven't been to a board benefit, I highly encourage you to come to that one. So that displaces us for second Saturday. So on Saturday, June 3rd, our speaker that month will be Melissa Wynn. Some of you might know her from Civil War Times magazine. She was the chief of photography for Civil War Times, but just within the past week, she took a new job at the American Battlefield Trust. So she will be coming here to speak about her background is in photography, and she's a big collector of Civil War photos, and she will be speaking about the photos of the dead letter office during the Civil War. So that should be a good talk. She's a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to having her back here. So that brings us to our speaker today. Evan Portman is, he describes himself as a fledgling historian. I don't know if I would consider him fledgling. He's a pretty impressive young man here, but he's from Export, Pennsylvania. He's currently an intern with the American Battlefield Trust, as well as a continuing education instructor for the Penn-Trafford Area Recreation Commission. Evan is a guest contributor at Emerging Civil War. You can find several pieces that he's done there for us, and they are all fantastic. And he has his own YouTube channel dedicated to exploring the lesser known sites of the Battle of Gettysburg. A recent graduate of Saint Vincent College, he is currently pursuing a Master of History at Duquesne University. Ladies and gentlemen, Evan Portman.
Thanks, John Eric. It's great to be back here talking about the civilian experience at Gettysburg, which I think is a really interesting kind of perspective on an old story that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And it's becoming more, I think, a little bit more of a popular take, with the Adams County Historical Society devoting a lot to this civilian side of things. But one of the most frequent misconceptions, I think, about Gettysburg is that it's often described as this little, sleepy town in South Central Pennsylvania, and maybe by today's standards, it was. But in 1863, it was actually a pretty lively town. It had a population of about 2,400 by 1860, making it about 100 people short of a small city. It also had a very vibrant political, social, and economic life, being the seat of Adams County. So there were judges and lawyers coming through pretty frequently. Had two institutions of higher learning, the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and at that time, Pennsylvania College, which is now Gettysburg College. Gettysburg had about 44 businesses, the most prominent of them being carriage makers. It also had gas lighting in the town, which was kind of an edgy thing in the 1860s, a pretty new technological innovation. And Gettysburg also in 1859 got the railroad, which was a critical step in opening this town to the world and to the rest of the United States, to the civilians of Gettysburg. There you can see on the right one of Gettysburg's gas lights, street lights in the Seminary Ridge Museum. You can go and see it today. And on the left, then and now, photograph of the Gettysburg Square. But in 1860 and 1861, rather, when the Civil War began, there was a pretty pressing or familiar threat of rebel invasion. And in fact, there were rumors of a Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania pretty much throughout the entire war. And by 1863, it pretty much became white noise to the people of Gettysburg. It was one of those things that they were just kind of like, yeah, well, we've heard that before. There was a battle at Antietam not too far away, and the rebels, got beat there and turned around. So they're not going to come into Gettysburg. But that changed again in June of 1863, when news reached the town that Robert E. Lee was moving up through the Blue Ridge Mountains into Maryland and eventually into Pennsylvania in his second invasion of the North. And Chambersburg Street resident Sarah Broadhead wrote in June of 1863 that not until the 15th was this threat really felt by the people of Gettysburg, this threat of a Confederate invasion. And that's when a telegram from Governor Andrew Curtin arrived in Gettysburg, telling the residents to move their stores and move their money and all of their supplies to a secure location that the Confederates wouldn't be able to find. And another message arrived from Harrisburg on June 20th, 1863, that called for volunteers to help suppress this invasion, because at that time, nobody knew where Lee was going. You know, some people out here thought he was going to end up in Pittsburgh. A lot of people thought he would end up in Harrisburg, and of course he nearly did. And Philadelphia was also threatened, and of course Washington, D.C. So to assuage the citizens' fears in Gettysburg, a regiment of cavalry militia was raised, and also the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Volunteers, which was made up of mostly people from Gettysburg, a few townies, a couple young drummer boys from Adams County. And on the morning of June 26th, that regiment of militia is going to engage the Confederates on the Chambersburg Pike. So this is the precursor to the Battle of Gettysburg, which begins on July 1st. So a few days beforehand, Confederates under Jubal Early come through Gettysburg, foraging for supplies, because they're the advance guard of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And they come down the Chambersburg Pike, and they encounter these militiamen from the 26th Pennsylvania. And the 26th Pennsylvania managed to fire a few volleys, and they turn around and run because they're not trained volunteers like the Army of the Potomac. And there's actually a monument to the 26th PA emergency right on the Chambersburg Pike. You can kind of see it as you're going down Route 30, whizzing by. It's just before the Weisler House that the National Park Service has just recently purchased and renovated. And that's where this first battle of Gettysburg takes place, out on the pike. So Jubal Early's 5,000 battle-hardened troops then moved down the road and quickly dispersed this emergency unit. And this opens the way for the Confederates to come in and capture Gettysburg, essentially. And as they enter the town on the Chambersburg Pike and then Chambersburg Street, the officers of Early's cavalry are brandishing their swords and firing pistols into the air. And to the 10-year-old Gates Faunastock, whose family lives in Gettysburg, this looks like a Wild West show to him, he wrote after the fact, which I think is pretty cool to see this through the eyes of a 10-year-old. And he would think that it's, something pretty neat that the Confederates are coming in and firing their guns and, waving their swords around. But one thing that most residents noted during this time was that the Confederates were almost entirely shoeless, which is also something to consider. Matilda, or as she goes by, Tilly Pierce, who lived on Baltimore Street, remembered that the Confederates came by and began capturing everyone's horse. And these horses had been taken down Baltimore Street, and they were trying to hide them from the Confederates by a group of local boys. And the Confederates found them, so they came back up through town, parading these horses they captured, of course, to use, by their army. And Tilly Pierce remembered seeing her horse that she'd grown fond of in this group, and her father went up to the Confederates to try to lobby them to give their horse back. And one of the Confederate colonels told James Pierce that word on the street was that he was an abolitionist, and that he probably took more from the Confederate army than they were taking from him. So they kept his horse. But as the Confederates are swarming around Gettysburg, Tilly's mother realizes that one of the boys that was living with them from another Gettysburg family, that was kind of a hand around the house. His name was Sam. She noticed that he was missing and that the Confederates had taken him. So Tilly Pierce's mother goes up to the Confederates and tries to persuade them to give them this boy back. And Tilly remembers this girl who was the boy's sister, presumably, cross the street yelling, if the Rebs take my Sam or our Sam, I don't know what I'll do with you folks. And Tilly in her memoir doesn't reveal the identity of this sister. But the boy, his name was Samuel S. Wade, and the sister was none other than Jenny Wade, who would be killed later on in the battle. So as General Early is seizing this town, you can see a painting of him up there going through the diamond or the square. He calls the town fathers together and he writes up these demands, which he did in Chambersburg, he does in Gettysburg, he'll do it throughout Pennsylvania to requisition supplies for his army. And he wants sugar, coffee, flour, salt, bacon, onions, and whiskey. He also orders 1,000 pairs of shoes, which might be where the shoe myth comes in later on. 500 hats and $5,000 in hard cash, which the town gives him to, make sure he doesn't burn it down, essentially. But one item of value that the people of Gettysburg could not provide early, and early is in dire need of it, is the position of the Union Army in Maryland. And nobody around Gettysburg seems to know where the Union Army is. They know that they're, pursuing the Confederates up into Maryland and Pennsylvania, but nobody knows exactly where they are. So on June 26th, Sarah Broadhead, another resident of Gettysburg, who leaves a pretty prolific account of the battle, met soldiers, Confederate soldiers, that she described as a miserable looking set. And she talks at length about how, the Confederates don't have shoes and they're very, ragged looking. And she passed the most uncomfortable night of her life, she said, that night, afraid that her husband, who was away working for the railroad, might be captured by the rebels. She was in her 30s in 1863, and she lived with her husband Joseph in a 2-story brick home on Chambersburg Street with their 4-year-old daughter Mary. Her husband worked for the railroad, and he also served as a lieutenant in the local militia during the war. And she kept as I said, a pretty prolific diary throughout the 3 days of the battle and that entire summer. And on his way home from New York, Daniel Skelly, who was 18 years old in 1863, was in a position where he could see the arrival of both the Union and the Confederate Army. There's Daniel Skelly right there. His brother was Jack Skelly, who served in the 87th Pennsylvania and was wounded in the Battle of Winchester just that month in 1863, who was a close friend at least, possibly the fiance of Jenny Wade. So that's Jack's brother, Daniel, there. And Daniel, as I said, was 18, and he worked at the Faunastock Brothers dry goods store. Picture you can see there on Baltimore Street. It was used by the U.S. Sanitary Commission after the battle, and a place where he was employed and was familiar with in 1863. So on June 26th, as the Confederates are coming through Gettysburg, Daniel Skelly's out in Hanover. He's coming back from New York with some of his friends, and the last train to Gettysburg is canceled, and it's overcrowded. The last train that comes in, rather, is overcrowded with people fleeing from the Confederate Army. So he and his friends don't have a way back, at least an easy way back. So they take a handcar back down the railroad into Gettysburg that day. And This is Tilly Pierce, who I mentioned on the left. Her house there on Baltimore Street is next to the Shriver House Museum, if you're familiar with that. She and the Shrivers, she was with the Shrivers for most of the battle when they left town and sought refuge down the Taneytown Road. So on June 30th, just the day before the battle, a few days after the Confederates come through and leave, the arrival of 2 Union brigades under General John Buford starts to calm the people of Gettysburg down. They see, the Union blue come in and they feel more safe than they did when the Confederates were there. And Daniel Skelly notes that in his book after the war. And 10-year-old Gates Fahnestock and some of the other children of the town took that time to walk through the Union encampments and look at all of these, soldiers and different people, a panorama of thousands of men in blue and sabers and bayonets. And again, to a 10-year-old, that's cool. He doesn't know what is about to happen. The people that are going to die. And it's interesting. He notes that it's after 2 years of war, he hears about this war. It's finally in front of him. He's finally able to kind of connect the dots, see what this war is like. So on the morning of July 1st, the residents of Gettysburg begin to brace for a fight. And Sarah Broadhead, who lived on Chambersburg Street, said, "We little dreamed of the momentous events which were soon to happen right in our midst." Here you can see some of the Union cavalry on the town square getting ready to fend off the rest of the Confederate army that's coming in on the Chambersburg Pike. So on the morning of July 1st, as the first shots of the battle start to ring out on McPherson and Her Ridge and Weisler's Ridge, Daniel Skelly climbs up this, he said it's a good-sized oak tree to have a better view of the fighting so he can see out, on those ridges. And if you've been to Gettysburg, the rolling hills, the rolling ridges, what the terrain looks like. And he saw Buford's 2 brigades of cavalry beginning to deploy with their horses to fight this delaying action against the Confederates. And he said, "We could then hear distinctly the skirmish fire in the vicinity of Marsh Creek where the first shots were fired, about 3 miles from our position, and could tell that it was approaching nearer and nearer as our skirmishers fell back slowly toward the town, contesting every inch of ground." So Buford's troopers, they'll go out in squads essentially, and a few of them will, fire their carbines, and one of the troopers will remain behind with the horses, and they'll fire on one of the ridges, and then they'll go down the ridge, get on their horses, ride back to the next ridge, then they'll get off and fire at the Confederates again, and mount back up, ride to the next ridge. So he's fighting this, this delaying action to wait until the rest of the Union army comes up to reinforce him. So Skelly and the others could see this from this tree that he climbs up. And as other Confederates approach and begin to deploy their artillery, shells began to fly over his head when he's up in this tree, and it becomes kind of a precarious position for him. And he climbs back down the oak tree, and he remembers joining the rest of this stampede of civilians who were running back down the Chambersburg Pike to get away from the battle. And as he runs down the pike, he remembers this Union general and his staff galloping up the pike, with the brass and with flag. And he thought years afterwards that this was Major General John Reynolds, who was coming up with the Union First Corps, and who would be killed moments later by the Confederates. So as Skelly comes back down to the town, he still wants to get a better look at the fighting. So he goes to his to work essentially, and he goes up the Fahnestock house to an observatory. And the observatory, if you see the kind of the flat roof of the Fahnestock house, that's where the observatory was. It's still there. even though the Fahnestock House has changed a lot, you can still go up and kind of see what it was like back then. So Skelly goes up there to try and get a better view of the fighting. And when he climbs up the trap door up to the observatory around 10 or 11 o'clock, he notices another general, Union general, gallop down Baltimore Street, and that's Oliver Otis Howard, who is named Old Prayer Book for his devout Protestantism, or also Howard by members of the Union 11th Corps because they have such contempt for him. But Howard, on the first day of Gettysburg, he's actually doing pretty well. So he's given this, this situation after Reynolds dies. So he's in command of the Union troops on the field at that point, and he wants to, continue this plan of holding the Confederates off and allowing the rest of the Union Army to come up and reinforce them. So Howard wants to get a better look of the area too. And that's when he comes over to the Fahnestock House, and Skelly takes him up to this observatory and allows Howard to look out, across the fields to the west of Gettysburg, but also to the north, where the 11th Corps is going to come up and deploy. So, places like Barlow's Knoll and Oak Hill, he's able to see that from the Fahnestock observatory. And Skelly is standing there next to Howard, and he's watching him, study the battlefield with his glasses. And a scout comes up and actually, rides up to the house, and he hollers up to the roof while Howard's up there. And that's when Howard learns that General Reynolds has been killed, and Howard is now in command of the Union Army on the field at Gettysburg. And later on, after the war, Skelly and Howard actually had a reunion of sorts in Gettysburg. They hooked back up with each other and went back to this area in town and kind of reunited after so many years had passed. So meanwhile, back on McPherson Ridge, the Union line is beginning to crumble and give way. In the middle of the afternoon, after both sides receive these reinforcements. And as the Union troops are starting to break on, at that point, Seminary Ridge, a Union officer rides down into the town, and he yells, "All you good people, go down to your cellars or you will be killed." And Albertus McCreary, who is another civilian resident of Gettysburg, remembered this and remembered kind of being, taken by the alarm and the seriousness of the moment, and running down to his cellar as the Union Army is going to begin to retreat through the town. Sarah Broadhead's diary that night wrote of the bustle and the confusion of the Union retreat as hundreds of these blue troops are fleeing through the streets of town, pursued by the Confederates. She said, "No one can imagine what extreme fright we were in when our men began to retreat." And that was July 1st was baking day for Sarah Broadhead, sort of like the Jenny Wade story, who's baking bread on the third day when she's killed. July 1st was baking day for Sarah Broadhead. She just finished preparing her bread to go into the ovens when she heard these cannons out on McPherson Ridge and Seminary Ridge. So she went down to her cellar, and that's where she experienced most of the rest of the Battle of Gettysburg from her basement. But she would go back up to the ground level of her house and continue baking and cooking for the rest of her family and some of her neighbors. So around 4 o'clock on July 1st, as these Union troops are retreating through town, a Union lieutenant who's wounded in the foot reaches Daniel Skelly's backyard. And he hid his pistol and his sword in a neighboring alleyway belonging to the Bowen family, the neighbors of the Skellys, whom they rented from. And Confederate soldiers are right behind him, and they find this Union soldier and they took his sword and they made him his prisoner. And having this unfold from their kitchen, Daniel Skelly's mother requested that the Confederates allow the lieutenant to enter the Skelly's home so that she could tend to his foot injury. And the Confederates agreed. So Elizabeth Skelly actually took the opportunity to hide the soldier in an inner room of their house, and she kept him there without the Confederates discovering him for the rest of the battle. So they saved him, potentially saved his life. Carrie Sheeds, who operated a school for young girls, and lived on the Chambersburg Pike. You can see her house there. The Lutheran Seminary on the left. So that's just down the ridge from Lee's headquarters, the Widow Thompson house. That's where she lived during the battle in 1863. And she found herself converted, she said, from the principal of a young ladies' school to, into a ladies' superintendent of an army hospital for those 3 days and beyond. But as the battle's beginning here on the ridge, Colonel Charles Wheelock, the 97th New York, runs down the Chambersburg Pike, coming towards us. And he runs into the Sheeds house, closely followed by Confederates. And he ran down the cellar, but the rebels followed him. So Carrie went down too, and she was pleading for them to let him go and not kill him in her house. But when the Confederates demanded that he surrender, Wheelock refused to hand over his sword. So saving his life, she took his sword when they weren't looking, and she hid it under her dress. So when the Confederates turned around again, they weren't able to capture his sword. So they paraded, Colonel Wheelock off without their souvenir, without the proof that he was captured. And later on, Colonel Wheelock actually returned when the Confederates left Gettysburg. He returned to the Sheeds house, and Carrie Sheeds gave him back his sword. So that's one of the really interesting human interest stories on the first day there, involving some of the civilians. But a lot of the instances occur, and there you can see that's a post-war picture of the Sheeds house. It looks pretty much the same today, minus the telephone poles and the tree and the house next door. But these instances occur pretty frequently, especially in the first days as the Union troops are retreating and the Confederates are following them. Catherine Foster and her family lived in Gettysburg in this house, you can see. And they were hiding in their basement during the fight when a Union soldier knocks on their door and it says, "Hide me, hide me." So this soldier is Corporal Leander Wilcox of Company F of the 151st Pennsylvania, which fought out on McPherson Ridge. So they hid him in the potato bin, not the cellar. And when the Confederates come by and knock again to look for him, because they're going, house to house to find any of these Union soldiers who were hiding, Catherine gave permission to the Confederates to search the house. And they found other Union soldiers in the house, actually, but they did not find Corporal Leander Wilcox of the 151st Pennsylvania. And again, when you're driving through Gettysburg, if you go out there, you can see the houses. Many of the houses are still there, where these events took place. So as the Union troops are flooding through town, their rally point is Cemetery Hill. And as all of these troops are, regrouping on the hill, Oliver Otis Howard is back there, and he's, positioning regiments and batteries to brace for a potential attack by the Confederates. And he's meeting with the cemetery keeper's wife, Elizabeth Thorne, and her two sons who were there, and Dave McConaughey, who is the executive of this evergreen cemetery, which gives Cemetery Hill its name. And they're standing underneath the gatehouse there, and he's talking with these two individuals. And Howard lost his his arm, I believe on the peninsula. So his one of his arms is, of course, gone. So he just has a loose sleeve, kind of dangling there. So as he's talking with Elizabeth Thorne and David McConaughey, her two sons, the Thorne boys, are flipping his empty sleeve up, and they're trying to flip it and get it to stay up on his shoulder. And eventually he takes one of the boys and he grabs him, and he kind of hugs him up against his chest to get the kid to stop. And the kid does stop. But again, it's like, 10-year-old Gates Fahnestock. There's the biggest battle in the Western Hemisphere is happening, and these two little kids are, find Howard's empty sleeve to, play around with. It's one of my favorite stories. But Elizabeth Thorne lived in this gatehouse with her husband, who was the keeper, Peter Thorne. And Peter's serving in the war. He went to war in 1862, leaving Elizabeth to much of the day-to-day tasks of keeping up the cemetery and burying the dead. And as the troops are fleeing, she's talking with the Union soldiers, and eventually she'll play a pretty big part in burying a lot of the dead. And she's also pregnant during this time. So that's pretty interesting. There's a monument there. It's the Gettysburg Women's Memorial, and it's her wiping her brow mid burial essentially, and you can see that she's expecting. So as the sun sets on July 1st on Cemetery Hill, the Confederates then converge on Gettysburg, and they begin to establish a battle line through the town. Robert Rhodes' division of Early's Corps, or Early's division, Richard Ewell's corps rather, is going to bivouac into town and establish. That's where their battle line is. And Daniel Skelly remembers right outside his house, Confederates, lighting campfires and cooking, because the town is being occupied by Confederates once again, just like on the 26th. And several Confederates were encamped outside the William McLean house. And that night on July 1st, one of his daughters comes up to him. She's young, she's about 4 years old, and she asks her dad if she can go out and sing to the Confederates. So, he doesn't see any harm in that. So he brings his daughter out, and she starts singing "Hang Jeff Davis from a Sour Apple Tree" to the Confederates, who, weren't all that mad, because she's, of course, 4 years old. But when the citizens awoke in Gettysburg on July 2nd, they're waking to a very different town, with the streets barricaded with furniture. The Confederates are going into houses and breaking doors down if they have to, bringing furniture out, tables, anything they can find to establish a battle line through the town in case any more fighting occurs, which there is. Houses are commandeered for sharpshooters. Stores are raided for food and supplies. So, what a lot of people, I don't think, realize is the town becomes just as much a part of the battlefield as the farms do, south and north and west of town. John Rupp's house on Baltimore Street, which is owned by the Gettysburg Foundation now, sheltered sharpshooters actually of both sides. So it was kind of in that no man's land during the skirmishing on July 2nd and 3rd, where Confederates would occupy it. When they're forced out, the Union would come in and use it. And John Rupp said, "Our men occupied my porch, and the rebels in the rear of the home." So at some points, there were Union soldiers and Confederates occupying the house at the same time. He's down in the basement in the cellar, hearing this take place upstairs. The townsfolk could also hear this persistent skirmishing throughout the town and on the battlefield. And there's this really fierce skirmishing on July 2nd. And it's something else that doesn't get a lot of attention. in the area of the Dobbin House and some of that area south of town, with Orland Smith's brigade of the 11th Corps, who took nearly as many casualties as some of the units out on the field, just from skirmishing. Albertus McCreary remembered this kind of taking place, and he wrote, "We did not dare to look out of the windows on the Baltimore Street side, since sharpshooters from Cemetery Hill were watching all the homes for Confederate sharpshooters and picking off every person that they saw. From that distance, they could not distinguish a citizen from a soldier. And on the High Street side, however, we could stay out on the porch during the heavy artillery fire." So, it became dangerous for a lot of these civilians, because the Union troops aren't going to take a chance that person, in the window isn't a Confederate who could then, have the opportunity to shoot them. Liberty Hollinger remembered that her father dressed up in his favorite gray suit when the Confederates were around until they came under fire from the Union. Then he went downstairs and put on a blue one to, kind of play both sides and not get shot. And in the afternoon of July 2nd, throughout the day, many of the buildings in town are requisitioned as hospitals, including this church here, St. Francis Xavier, which is the Catholic church. And Elizabeth Salome, who goes by Sally Myers, lives a few doors down from this church, and she remembered hearing the suffering and the groans inside. So she goes in and she wrote, "The men were scattered all over it, some lying on the pews and some on the bare floor. The suffering and the groans of the wounded and dying were terrible to see and hear. I knelt by the first one inside the door and said, 'What can I do for you?' He looked up at me with mournful eyes and said, 'Nothing, I'm going to die.'" And this was Sergeant Alexander Stewart of the 149th Pennsylvania. So Sally's so overcome by this experience that she immediately runs out of the church and starts to weep. But she musters the strength to go back in, and she returns to Stewart, and she reads him a Bible verse, which is the last chapter, the last verse that his father happened to read before he left for the war. And it's the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John. "Peace I leave with you. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." And Sally Myers brings Alexander Stewart back to her home, actually, after the battle. She nurses him until he dies on July 6th, 2 days after the armies leave. Later that month, she receives a letter from Alexander Stewart's younger brother. His name's Henry. And a romance starts to develop between the two of them, between Sally and Henry. And they end up marrying in 1867. But the marriage ends with Henry's death the next year. So it was short-lived, but she did give birth to one son, who was Henry Alexander Stewart. And he became a physician and a founder of one of Gettysburg's early local hospitals, as well as the Adams County Historical Society, which still exists today. And he began to start to preserve his mother's recollections of the battle in the years after the war and after her death. Later that evening, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, residents of the town could begin to hear an influx, in the barrage and the cannonading along the Confederate line as they begin to prepare for their attack on places like Little Round Top and the wheat field, Peach Orchard, and of course Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. And when the fighting ended later that night, late in the evening, Sarah Broadhead lamented that we gain no information from the rebels and are shut off from all communication with our soldiers, because of course the Union Army is down south of town and the Confederates are controlling the town. So nobody really knows what's happening. They can hear the guns. They don't know what the result is. Michael Jacobs, who's a professor of math at Pennsylvania College, wrote, "To us, the results seemed doubtful and gloomy. Forebodings filled our minds. but there was an entire absence of that elation and that boastfulness which the Confederates manifested when they entered the town on the evening of July 1st. So to Jacobs, when the Confederates come in and they win on July 1st, they're happy, of course. But on July 2nd, there's an absence of that that jubilation that he noticed when they won the day on July 1st. So as the sun rises on July 3rd, the residents have this similar apprehension about the battle because they don't know what's going on. And during that morning, around the same time that Jenny Wade is killed, an artillery shell crashes through the home of Elizabeth McLean. And 45 years later, she wrote, "There was a loud crash and a shell came tearing through a 15-inch brick wall, striking a beam that supported the roof, split it in two, broke out a rung from the crib in which we had slept when we were children, and having spent its force, rolled down the stairs to the first landing. The garret was filled with a cloud of brick dust, and we thought it was on fire, but the shell did not explode." And that happened pretty frequently. You drive through Gettysburg, you can kind of see some buildings still have a shell in the brick and mortar. But even after the war and after the battle, there were instances of unexploded ordnance. In fact, I just found one in Round Top a few weeks ago, and kids going up, and some instances of injury and death. Jenny Wade was the only one killed during the battle, but there were fatalities as a result of the battle afterwards and after the war. So it kind of goes back to that question, what defines a casualty of the war, of the battle? Is it someone killed, wounded, or captured during the battle, or what about these people that suffer from the effects of war even after? Something to consider. But around 1 o'clock on July 3rd, 170 Confederate guns open up on Seminary Ridge, beginning the famous bombardment before Pickett's charge. And people as far as Philadelphia could hear this. So of course the people in Gettysburg were well aware. And Sarah Broadhead wrote, again, the battle began with unearthly fury. Nearly all the afternoon, it seemed as if the heavens and earth were crashing together. The time that we sat in the cellar seemed long, listening to the terrific sounds of the strife. A more terrible sound never greeted human ears. And Henry Eyster Jacobs, who is Michael Jacobs' son, who becomes a Lutheran theologian himself later on, he goes up to the garret or the attic of his house, and he and his dad are looking through this. You can kind of see the garret window on the side of the house, the highest window. It's the one on the other side. They go up and look out that window to try and see Pickett's charge, and they see Confederates out on Seminary Ridge deploying for battle. And that's one of those things, I think it really humanizes the experience, because a lot of people, unless you're in the military, it's hard to imagine what the battle would be like. But this civilian experience is, I think, a little bit more accessible for a lot of people, because you can relate to it. And here's a guy and his son going upstairs trying to watch Pickett's charge out of their attic window, which is really cool to read about. So when the Union finally wins on July 3rd, spoiler alert, the townspeople don't know that, because again, they're still occupied by the Confederate army. But they continue to observe this somber attitude from the Confederates. They're not happy. They're not firing their pistols off like they were earlier, in the campaign. So around July 4th, around 4 a.m. that morning, Daniel Skelly is sleeping, and he remembers waking up and hearing this big commotion outside his window. And he looks out. Actually, he spent the night in the Fonistock house where he worked, and he sees blue troops marching through the town. So finally, he knows that they probably won, and that the Union Army is taking back the town. And he recognized, of course, what this meant, and he rushed downstairs And he starts comparing notes with some of the Union soldiers, telling them what happened in the town, and they're telling him what happened out on the battlefield. And he and his friends spent the following days, and of course, the following months, exploring as an 18-year-old would, some of the locations like the Round Tops and Meade's headquarters and Ziegler's Grove, and Culp's and Cemetery Hills, looking for artifacts or debris, and kind of scavenging the battlefield. And the Lutheran Theological Seminary, quickly, like many houses, many buildings in the town, becomes a hospital. People like Isaac Trimble, who's wounded on the third day during Pickett's charge, are treated there. Actually, a fair amount of names that you would recognize, famous individuals from the battle, become patients here. And the Ziegler family, who are essentially the caretakers of the seminary building, they return home. They fled the area for the battle, and they come back to the seminary, and they find essentially this scene here in this painting, except there wouldn't be Confederates in there, but tents and wounded and dying doctors and surgeons. And they find that their building, the seminary, is a hospital, and they kind of pledge their help to see what they can do, getting water for people, and using their well outside. And little 10-year-old Hugh Ziegler, his responsibility was to collect up the amputated limbs and dump them outside the window. So in total, there were about 600 wounded that received medical care at this seminary hospital. And earlier we talked about Elizabeth Thorne there. You can see her statue there. She's 5 months pregnant, and she's given this task of burying a lot of the dead in Evergreen Cemetery, because there's already cemetery there before the National Cemetery is established later that year. And she wrote that 15 soldiers were buried beside the pump shed. I went to the cellar to look for the good things I had put there on the first night of the battle, and everything was gone but 3 feather beds, and they were full of blood and mud. And with her elderly father and her 2 sons, who were flipping Oliver Otis Howard's empty sleeve, they buried over 90 Union soldiers within weeks of the battle in the cemetery. And there's actually there are some Confederates who were accidentally buried in Evergreen Cemetery. You can find where they are. And this problem of the dead and the wounded is one that's so significant. It becomes kind of a community issue for the people. You can smell the death in the weeks and months after the battle. And they established this hospital called Camp Letterman. And that first photo taken from Seminary Ridge, you can see the tents all the way out beyond the town where some of the hotels are now. It's like where the Hilton Garden Inn is now. That's where Camp Letterman was. So they established this temporary hospital called Camp Letterman, named after David Letterman, who was the chief medical officer of the Army of the Potomac from Pittsburgh. And people like Tilly Pierce, the young girl on Baltimore Street, and Sally Myers go out and they work in this hospital to tend to the sick and the wounded for the rest of the summer and part of the early autumn of 1863. And not until November of that year, when the Soldiers National Cemetery is dedicated, the citizens of Gettysburg really receive this closure for what they witnessed. Those 3 days and that summer of 1863. But even with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the town would again, achieve this prominence and all this attention that they did on those 3 days in July 1863. And it's something that, it was just changed the community forever. They would never be this normal town, in South Central Pennsylvania, with the greatest battle in American history being fought there. And it's something that they would have to, kind of adapt to, even now it's something that's to consider. And there was no doubt of this fact that the Gettysburg would be changed forever. And as we, kind of wrap up here, I think a quote from Tilly Pierce's recollections really epitomizes how Gettysburg, this experience, the civilian experience of Gettysburg, really went from this, normal little town to something really different and something monumental. She wrote, "Today, Gettysburg is a changed place. A new spirit and enterprise have taken hold of its inhabitants, and evidences of improvement and modern progress are everywhere. But scarcely a day passes that does not witness some pilgrimage to this Mecca of loyal devotion to human sacrifice." Thanks for coming out today. Hopefully you enjoyed this different perspective, and hope to see you again sometime. Thanks.